Welcome to the third panel of the day. My name is Machalagh Carr. I'm the General Counsel and Parliamentarian at the Committee on Ways and Means. I'd like to thank the Federalist Society and Article 1 Initiative for hosting this excellent conference and bringing together these thoughtful panels. This afternoon's panel is on the Congressional Reflections and Recommendations, and it brings together an impressive array of experts on constitutional function, maybe constitutional dysfunction, to be determined. To my immediate right is Professor Josh Chafetz, a professor of law at Cornell Law School, an expert on structural constitutional law, legislative and legislative procedure, and the intersection of law and politics. He is an editor of the preeminent casebook on legislation, Cases and Materials on Legislation and Regulation, and his most recent book speaks in part to some of what we're discussing today, Congress's Constitution, Legislative Authority, and the Separation of Powers. Not here physically, but here with us in spirit is Professor David Schoenbrod, a professor of law at New York Law School, and his most recent book, DC Confidential, Inside the Five Tricks to Washington, has forwards by both Governor Howard Dean and Senator Mike Lee, who we were just lucky enough to just hear from. He has served on the staffs of the Natural Resource Defense Council, the Cato Institute, and AEI. And farthest to my right is David Hoppe, president of Hoppe Strategies. He's worked extensively in both the House and the Senate and had a front row seat to some of the most significant constitutional events of our generation, including power shifts in the Senate and the impeachment trial of President Clinton. While working on the House side, he was also instrumental in accomplishing some the passage of some major pieces of legislation, which in today's environment, everybody knows what major achievements those really are. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you today. We anticipate great questions from our audience. So let's get started with opening remarks from each of you, starting with Professor Chafetz.
Well, thank you so much, Machalagh, and thank you to the Federalist Society for having me here today. It really is an honor and a privilege to be among so many distinguished experts and to be able to have this conversation with so many distinguished experts on what I regard as a vitally important topic. Before I say a few words about that topic, though, I do want to say a few words about the panel of experts that are gathered here today. I don't think it should escape our notice that over the course of the entire day, there have only been 2 women up on this stage, both in the role of moderators, and even fewer persons of color. And that's not because there aren't a huge number of women or persons of color who are more than qualified to be up here today. I mention this because I think it's incumbent on all of us who participate in and organize events like this to be conscious of this fact and to be conscious of what kind of image we present, what kind of image of an expert we leave our audiences with. Okay, with that said, let's move on to thinking about Congress. So as Senator Lee just reminded us in his remarks, Congress is not well liked, to put it mildly. And members of Congress of both parties will often be the first to tell you about all the ways in which their institution is dysfunctional, or at least not nearly so functional as it was back in some dimly remembered golden age. Of course, members of Congress decrying congressional performance, or the lack thereof, is as old as the institution itself. Less than 3 months into the first Congress in 1789, Fisher Ames, a Federalist representative from Massachusetts, wrote to a friend that he felt chagrined at the yawning listlessness of his colleagues. 5 years later, Vice President John Adams would mark the rise of the Jeffersonian faction in Congress by writing to his wife Abigail that the business of Congress this session is dullness, flatness, and insipidity itself. And as Ames, again, was preparing to retire from Congress in 1796, he wrote to another friend, "Do not ask what good we do. That is not a fair question in these days of faction." So this sort of elite political dismissal of elite politicians has ebbed and flowed throughout American public discourse. But for several decades now, at least, we've been at what we might call a local high point. In 1977, the great Congress scholar Morris Fiorina wrote that the campaigns of 1976 offered a curious spectacle. Serious candidates for national office ran for Washington office by running against Washington. But if the spectacle was curious in 1976, it has become utterly banal today. Members of Congress of both parties routinely run against Washington and attempt in whatever way possible to connect their opponents to, in newly prominent language describing an old sentiment, the swamp. This sort of attack resonates with the public because, as political scientists John Hibbing and Elizabeth Thiesmorse put it in a book tellingly titled Congress as Public Enemy, Americans want what they called stealth democracy. That is, Americans claim to value robust debate and compromise, but they in fact recoil from Congress precisely because it's the institution that most visibly instantiates those qualities in action. Put differently, in their words, the people want democratic procedures, but they do not want to see them in action. This means that Congress starts at an institutional disadvantage as against the other branches. After all, judges speak primarily through densely written opinions, largely impenetrable to outsiders, and even when they disagree vehemently with one another, they do so behind the genteel mask of legal prose. And the executive is identified in the public mind with a single figure, the president. Although, to be honest, the illusions of executive unitariness and univocality are becoming harder to sustain by the hour. But as a general matter, these other institutions of government paper over their disagreements, their deal-making, their internal politicking. This makes them better practitioners of the stealth part of Hibbing and Thiesmorse's stealth democracy. So, as I said, Congress starts out at something of a disadvantage. And this disadvantage matters because, as I've argued at some length in my recent book, Congress's Constitution, governing institutions' strength, their actual small c constitutional power, is something that's produced through their engagements with the public. And that was something that both Senator Lee and Senator Kyle hit on as well. Both the executive and the judiciary have played the architectonic long game, creating and structuring their institutions so as to facilitate the sorts of public engagement that enhances their power. And Congress has, at times, done so as well. But in recent years, I would suggest, it's been a poor steward of its own power, and as a consequence, that power has diminished. So in the interest of staying within time and leaving plenty of time for Q&A, I want to just focus on one way in which Congress has been institutionally careless, although there are plenty of others, and we've heard about a number of them throughout the day. But I suspect the way that I'm going to choose to focus on will be of more than casual interest to some people here today, and that is congressional staffing. So Congress has always had some staff. Immediately after electing Frederick Muhlenberg of Pennsylvania as its first speaker, the House also hired a clerk, a doorkeeper, and a sergeant. But staffing long remained anemic and limited to those sorts of officers of the House as a whole. The Senate Finance Committee was authorized to employ a clerk starting in the 1840s, and in 1857, that right was extended to all Senate standing committees. The House got a later start. It authorized the Ways and Means Committee to employ clerks in 1856, and other committees were authorized to employ staff at various points throughout the remainder of the 19th century. But it wasn't until the final decade and a half of the 19th century that individual members were permitted to hire even a single employee. The growth in both the size of Congress itself and of the number of staffers then led to the construction of the first two congressional office buildings, now called the Cannon and Russell buildings, both of which opened in the first decade of the 20th century. Nevertheless, congressional staffing remained anemic. Committees from both houses frequently borrowed staffers from various administrative agencies, a practice that became especially prevalent with the proliferation of committees and subcommittees during the Second World War. These borrowings from the executive agencies presented two distinct concerns. First, they suggested that the committees themselves were understaffed, and second, they raised the specter of a conflict of interest. Senator Kenneth Wherry, a Republican from Nebraska, expressed a concern that such staffers were, in his words, loyal to the organization that employed them. He said, being employed by a department, to a certain degree, they have a loyalty to that department, which otherwise they might give to the Senate committee in a study of the problems covered in the investigations. As Wherry's statement indicates, dual loyalties were a special problem in the context of committees' oversight functions. Inadequate internal resources were likely to give rise to inadequate ability to oversee the workings of the executive branch. In response to such concerns about legislative capacity, Congress, by large bipartisan margins, passed the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946 with the explicit aim of modernizing Congress to allow it to play a more forceful role in the increasingly robust American state. Among other things, the 1946 Act significantly increased the number of staffers for both members and committees, and it increased staffers' pay, creating the first sort of professionalized core of congressional staff. It also beefed up the nonpartisan staffing of both chambers, directing more resources to and placing on permanent footing the Legislative Reference Service, and it increased the staff of the offices of Legislative Counsel. Continuing in this vein a few decades later, the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 and subsequent cameral resolutions in 1974 and 75 also enhanced the staffing and staff training of both committee staff and member staff and gave increased committee personnel to the minority party. It also changed the name of the Legislative Reference Service to today's Congressional Research Service and gave it increased responsibility and staffing. The result of all this was a Congress that was able to marshal expertise, which enabled it to go toe-to-toe with the executive and sometimes even win, conducting vigorous oversight that simultaneously and relatedly built trust with the American public, kept presidents in check, and ensured a vigorous role for Congress in the affairs of the American state. The paradigmatic case during this time of a robust staff helping Congress check the president might be the House Judiciary Committee's Watergate investigation under Chairman Peter Rodino. But other, less spectacular but no less important instances would include things like increased staff capacity on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, exemplified by its first Chief of Staff, Francis Wilcox, who played a significant role in debates over the creation of NATO and the Marshall Plan. But what has happened in recent years? Well, as important new work by the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, a group made up of people from New America and the R Street Institute and well represented here today, has shown, the number of House staffers is significantly lower today than it was in the mid-1980s. In both chambers, the ratio of staff has shifted significantly more towards district staff and away from DC-based staff. Staff salaries, as a recent Brookings Institution study has shown, have declined over the course of the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Staff salaries are lower today than they were 17 years ago. And as a wholly unsurprising result of this, staff turnover levels are quite high. This is by no means limited to political staff. As another Brookings Institution study noted last year, the combined staff of 3 support agencies, the Congressional Research Service, the General Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office, have declined by a shocking 45% from 1975 to 2015. And if you doubt the incredible talent that is being lost in all of this, just think about the panelists today who are former staffers either for members of Congress or for these nonpartisan agencies, including most of the previous panel. Right? They're all doing something else now. This loss of expertise leaves Congress increasingly in the dark and increasingly dependent on the executive for what information it does receive. This was, of course, precisely one of the problems that the 1946 Act was originally meant to rectify. And I think it ties back in to the topic with which I began. The hollowing out of congressional staff demonstrates a disdain for Washington, a disdain for the institution of Congress, a disdain for the vitally important work of governing that happens here. It suggests that politics, at least legislative politics, is not, in Max Weber's famous formulation, a vocation, but rather something anyone can do. Indeed, something that any person off the street can do at least as well as staffers with years of experience. What need, then, would the institution, much less the American people, have for women and men with years of governing experience? Why not just send in the neophytes? Well, to the extent that you're all here today because you think that congressional power is important and worth promoting, I hope you'll see that posture for the pernicious one that it is. It's a posture that has already resulted in the transfer of significant amounts of governing capacity away from Congress and toward the executive, and to some extent, I would add, towards the courts. And it bids fair to continue in that same direction. For the sake of a balanced, well-governed polity, this ought to be fought against. Congressional capacity ought to be understood as something to be built, not something to be hollowed out, much less run against. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Schoenbrod, who is visiting us. We have a video clip since he was not able to be here in person.
I look forward to being with you and regret that Amtrak canceled the train. In grade school in the 1950s, snow never kept us away from school. We also sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee" wholeheartedly, because our country seemed a sweet land of liberty, in which government served the people. Our esteem for our government reflected that of the adults around us. Back then, polls showed that about 3/4 of voters trusted our government to do the right thing just about always. Today, sadly, only about 1/5 do. Most people don't know why we've lost our trust in government. Our complaints about Washington, although often valid, don't explain the loss of trust. Many people don't like Donald Trump, but the distrust was just as great under Barack Obama. Yes, indeed, gridlock and polarization are bad, but they're symptoms of a problem, not the underlying cause. To understand why Washington has lost our trust, we need to understand why it had it in the first place. The people who wrote the Constitution back in 1787 feared that a government based upon the consent of the people would, given people's clashing interests, lead to increasingly bitter divisions. To avert such a tragedy, the Constitution sought to have members of an elected Congress take responsibility for the consequences of the key policy choices. That's why Article 1 requires Congress to report the votes on controversial issues. In contrast, in Britain at the time, the members of Parliament could keep their doings secret. The responsibility of legislators for consequences was intended to spark open debate. If, for example, citizens of one city got their legislators to press for the government spending money on harbor improvements, they might well run up against legislators from other constituencies whose citizens would resent the cost. The open debate helped to hold the country together rather than tear it apart, because most people want not only to serve themselves, but to be fair to compatriots. Learning how one's demands will affect others, as happens with open debate, spurs the desire to be fair, as modern experiments and poll data show. Yet, human nature being what it is, there are still bound to be arguments in Congress, and there were. Yet, by resolving these arguments in the open, legislators enabled voters to accept the overall system to be fair. Win some, lose some. As The Economist magazine put it, a democratic system can maintain legitimacy despite rancorous politics if broad agreement exists on the fairness of the underlying rules of decision. In sum, legislators taking open responsibility for consequences helps to produce open debate, which in turn helps to produce trust in government. In the late 1960s, however, members of Congress began to legislate in ways that let them duck responsibility for unpopular consequences of their actions. Their responsibility for unpopular consequences would be apparent in a decision to raise taxes to finance popular projects. Then, the representatives who voted for the taxes would be held responsible. Today, the way out of that responsibility is obvious. Run a deficit, borrow the money. But that would not have worked in the early days because voters strongly opposed large deficits and borrowing except in an emergency. This opposition lasted well into the 20th century. As a candidate for president in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt vowed to cut federal spending 25%. Now, Roosevelt in office actually did run large deficits, but the country ran into large emergencies. Even so, in passing Social Security in 1935, President Roosevelt and Congress took responsibility for imposing taxes that would fully pay for the benefits then promised. Without an arrangement to do so, voters would have considered the whole scheme pie in the sky. Decades later, however, the public began to think of Washington as capable of working wonders. It had gotten the country through the Great Depression, won World War II, invented the atomic bomb, built the interstate highway system, presided over the world's richest economy, and even enacted meaningful civil rights legislation. With Washington's new potent reputation, Congress and President Lyndon Johnson got away with enacting Medicare in 1965 without imposing taxes sufficient to pay for the benefits then promised. That left responsibility for imposing taxes on future Congresses and presidents. Leaving large costs to the future became the course of least resistance for both spending increases and tax cuts. in times of boom or bust and under both parties. With regulation as well, practical considerations have long kept legislators from claiming responsibility for popular consequences, but ducking responsibility for unpopular ones. They had either enacted a regulation themselves, which made their responsibility for both the regulatory protection and the regulatory burdens evident, or they delegated responsibility to the agency, and the agency therefore took most of the responsibility for both the benefits and the burdens. Come the 1960s, however, Congress and President Richard Nixon devised a new approach to regulation that gave them most of the responsibility for the popular consequences and little of the blame for the unpopular. In the Cleaner Act of 1970, Congress granted all citizens a supposedly ironclad right to healthy air by the end of the 1970s and ordered the Environmental Protection Agency to impose the burdens necessary to make it so. Now, a few decades earlier, voters would have laughed at such a statute. It would have been inconceivable back then, when the government ran on carbon paper and adding machines, that an agency headquartered in Washington could regulate the millions of pollution sources sufficiently to make healthy air on a tight schedule. Yet by 1970, the government had Xerox machines and computers, and it also had landed people on the moon. And what the legislators said was, if we could put people on the moon, we could get the air clean on Earth. In enacting the statute, legislators did not bother to find out what type of burdens would have to be imposed to make the air healthy. They just simply reaped the credit, knowing that the burdens would be announced later and by an agency, so the agency would get the blame. That's why both Democrats and Republicans voted for the statute almost unanimously. Later, the agency found that meeting the statutory deadline would require imposing impossible burdens, like taking most of the cars off the roads in major cities. Legislators from both sides of the aisle blamed EPA for both the burdens it did impose and for its gross failure to clean the air by the statutory deadline. In just about every aspect of government, not just spending, not just taxes, not just regulation, Congress has found ways to take credit for popular promises, to shift blame for unpopular consequences. Both parties have done so, presidents have joined in. By ducking responsibility for unpopular consequences, members of Congress and presidents have soured our sweet land of liberty. Here's why. A government whose elected officials duck responsibility for unpopular consequences will produce more unpopular consequences. So we distrust it. Public-spirited organizations propose reforms to help government produce better results. More of those reforms would be adopted if the elected officials were actually responsible for the bad results. Elected officials can reward supporters in big business, big unions, and big advocacy groups for the support they get for re-election without taking a hit at the polls, because the politicians can avoid responsibility for unpopular consequences. So voters tend to think of Washington as a swamp run by special interests. Such officials who can avoid blame for unpopular consequences can stake out positions that thrill the base of their political party, yet minimize the risk of alienating centrist voters. Some can be for protecting children from pollution, others can be for protecting jobs from regulation. Neither of them are responsible for the other side of the equation, the regulatory costs or the health impacts. Politicians, in other words, can thus take all gain, no pain positions, as Professor Francis Lee calls them. That promotes polarization. Now, there are other factors that cause polarization, other things that prompt it, but the ability to take all gain, no pain positions makes it easier for politicians to give in to those prompts. So with all of these things going on, the polarization, the more bad consequences, the special interests, all that, no wonder it's hard that members of Congress find it hard to get voters to accept the compromises needed to legislate. That's why we have gridlock. Now, neither party can restore Article 1 by unilaterally dropping the legislative techniques that allow them to evade blame for unpopular consequences. Doing so would give the edge to the other party. The only hope is to impose new ground rules on Congress, on both parties, that would require both of them to shoulder responsibility. Now, it just so happens that I've written a book that proposes a statute to do so. The proposal is meant to favor neither party. That's why the book has forewords by Governor Howard Dean and Senator Mike Lee. I call the proposed statute the Honest Deal Act. It provides antidotes for the chief legislative tricks that officials use to duck responsibility. One is the money trick. As already discussed, it allows legislators and presidents to shift the blame for unpopular consequences to their successors in office. To stop that trick, some propose a constitutional amendment to require a balanced budget. The Honest Deal Act provides antidotes for the chief legislative tricks that officials use to duck responsibility. One is the money trick. As already discussed, it allows legislators and presidents to shift the blame for the unpopular consequences of spending increases and tax cuts. To stop that trick, some propose a constitutional amendment to require a balanced budget. It may well do some good, but the proposal is insufficient for two reasons. First, the problem is not so much deficits in this year or the next year. It's that current entitlement programs and tax policies will lead to enormous deficits in future decades. So balancing the budget in the near term is insufficient to avoid fiscal catastrophe. Second, no constitutional amendment of this sort is likely to pass anytime soon, but supporting it allows politicians to claim fiscal responsibility without actually having to take responsibility for tax increases or spending cuts. The Honest Deal Act would address these problems with a statutory fix, supplementing the drive for a balanced budget amendment. The statute would require putting in every mailbox and every year estimates of the annual cost to the average family of the tax increases or spending cuts needed to make the government sustainable over the long run, and how much that cost has changed due to the action or inaction of Congress over the past year. The second way to dodge responsibility I call the regulation trick. As already discussed, it allows legislators and presidents to shift the blame for unpopular consequences to an agency. The antidote is to enact a proposal by New Deal administrative law expert James Landis that once an agency makes a major regulatory change, it's not go into effect unless Congress enacts it. Stephen Breyer showed how to force Congress to vote these changes up or down on a tight timetable. As a result, elected officials would have to take responsibility for both regulatory protection and regulatory burdens. Now, the REINS Act, which, as you know, the House has repeatedly passed, would enact the Landis proposal. To that extent, it is pro-responsibility. But it also includes another provision that would require agencies to cap regulatory costs. To that extent, REINS would allow the legislators to take credit for holding down costs, but shift the blame to the agencies for limiting regulatory protection. This and other anti-regulatory provisions in REINS mean it won't get past the Senate. This means that the sponsors of REINS can say they are for legislative responsibility and cutting regulatory costs, but never have to vote to deny their constituents regulatory protection. So REINS repeats the regulation trick, but in the service of the opposite pole of the polarization. There are three other chief tricks. The federal mandate trick lets federal officials take credit for promising benefits to voters, but shift the blame for the burdens to state officials. The debt guarantee trick lets federal officials take credit for guarantees that subsidize risk-taking, but shift the blame for the bailouts to future legislators and presidents. The war trick lets legislators shift blame for the unpopular consequences of wars to the president. I don't have the time to describe the antidotes for these three tricks, but they are described in my website and book. In closing, I note that officials are now so busy dealing with crises that there seems no time to consider how to restore Article 1. But putting integrity back into Article 1 would help avert crises. More fundamentally, politicians who present voters with a vision of how restoring such integrity will sweeten our sour land will harvest votes.
David?
Thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to put this here so it doesn't fall down. That's right. In the spring of 1975, I had the great opportunity to come to graduate school in Washington and decided that I would stay here for a couple of years, like a lot of people, and go home, back to Wisconsin. It's now 43 years later, and I haven't left yet, so something is seriously wrong with me. But I started working on Capitol Hill in January of 1976, and for roughly the next almost 30 years, I worked on the House and the Senate side, half in the House, half in the Senate. I added a couple of times after that. I consider myself an institutionalist. I love the House of Representatives. I love the way it was set up. I love the way it works. I love the way the members work. And I love the Senate of the United States. I love the differences between the House and the Senate. I love the way it was set up by the founders. And my view is they did a job for us that we cannot imagine how that group, a group of people, had to be providential, that a group of people at that time was able to set up this system that has served us so well for 200 years. And until I find some people like Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and others, I'm going to stick with the guys who created that system, as opposed to the people who say, we got to change all this now. Doesn't work. Get rid of the filibuster, get rid of minority rights in the Senate. These are things that were set up and worked very well. The reason they don't work now is because of the use that they're put to by the people here. And that's not to say they're bad people, it's just to say things have changed. The question is, how do we rearrange them and get them back? Let me go back to start this talk by going back to George Mitchell, when he was majority leader. For people who were around when George Mitchell was majority leader in 1991, 1992, they used to watch the Senate on TV. And what would happen is a Republican would get up and offer an amendment. And all of a sudden, there'd be a lot of flurry on the floor, and they go into a quorum call, and then Senator Mitchell would go into his office with a number of Democrats. And the quorum call may last an hour, or 5 hours, or 2 days, or 5 days, whatever it took for him to work out among his Democrats an alternative amendment to put up to the Republican amendment so that their guys had a vote. He didn't stop you from voting. He just took all that time to work out an alternative, so politically he had something to balance it with. Frankly, not the worst system in the world, not the best, but not the worst system in the world. At least he didn't stop people from offering amendments. But that was a system, and that's the way George Mitchell worked the system. Now, he ran into a fairly significant problem in 1994. The president and first lady at that time had a policy which they wanted to enact to change the healthcare system in the United States. The problem was nobody liked what they wanted to do. And Senator Mitchell, being a dutiful majority leader to a Democratic president, said, I'll bring it up. For those who don't remember, we canceled the August recess for Senate in 1994, and Senator Mitchell kept the Senate in for 3 long weeks in August as the Democrats got their heads beaten in on Hillary Clinton's health care proposal. It was very interesting because the Republican members were so excited about this debate. They couldn't wait to go to the floor. We had lists of time when they could get on the floor, get their time to take whatever Democrat was standing there apart. And every Republican member of the Senate knew the Hillary Clinton plan and the problems with it better than any Democrat member of the Senate, and they literally took them apart. There was nothing that served the esprit de corps of Republican members in the Senate better than absolutely bashing whatever Democrat was standing there at that hour of that day. Finally, it got to the point where there were no Democrats on the floor. They just didn't come anymore because they knew they'd have their head handed to them. But once again, this was part of the process. This was a part of the process as you move forward where the Senate was literally open for debate. Let's go back a little bit further than that. And I think James Wallner mentioned it. Senator Mansfield, when LBJ was elected vice president, Senator Mansfield became the majority leader. After President Kennedy had died and LBJ was president, they were going to take up the Civil Rights Act. And LBJ called Mansfield down to the White House and he said, here's what you do. You put them on the floor and you just beat them up for a week. No amendments, beat them for a week, get cloture on this thing and let's go. Mike Mansfield thanked the president for his input, came back to the Hill and thought about it, and his response was to do just the opposite. To open up the floor of the Senate for weeks of amendments and weeks of debate. And the result of that was members got to try and change the policy, try and adjust the policy, try and fight the policy, try and filibuster the policy. But what the United States saw over these weeks of time was the country trying to deal with what had been an intractable problem up to that time. And watching, in fact, their government try and solve a problem that had not been solved up to that time. It didn't solve every problem and race problem by any means, but just that process started changing the views of the people in the United States. It served to help achieve the end. Most people don't remember and think about it very much, but in the 1976 campaign, in the Republican primary campaign, the Panama Canal was a huge issue. The Panama Canal was a huge issue. Frankly, Senator Jesse Helms helped make it a huge issue, but Ronald Reagan made it a huge issue. The question was, were we going to give the canal back to Panama? And Ronald Reagan said, no, we're not. We bought it, we built it, it's ours. Over the next 4 years, one of the issues that came was the Carter administration negotiated to give the Panama Canal back to Panama. And that had to be done by a treaty which, once again, on the floor of the Senate, took weeks and weeks to debate. You look at the 1981 tax reform bill that Ronald Reagan proposed. Open debate in the Senate made that a possibility. Even more so the 1986 tax reform bill. If you look at what happened in the House, the Democrats were in control of the House, the Republicans were in control of the Senate. The Democrats brought a bill that had none of the reforms, not one reform that the Reagan administration, the House Republicans, Jack Kemp, in fact, Bill Bradley and Dick Gephardt on the Democratic side wanted. Not one reform. That ultimately passed the House on Ronald Reagan's promise that if this is what came out of the conference, he would veto it because it was such a horrible piece of tax legislation, just didn't do anything to change fundamentally the tax. The Senate went into the Finance Committee and had hearings. Those hearings lasted about 5 or 6 weeks. They were getting right to the end where they were going to mark up the bill, and they were in no better shape than the House had been. It was a catastrophe. Until you had Bill Bradley and Senator Packwood, some of their staff got together Sunday night for dinner and said, look, let's give it a try. Let's just give it a try to do something different here. And lo and behold, they were able to work that fundamental change through the committee, a real committee markup process that you had people, frankly, on both sides of the aisle at that time, looking to make some fundamental changes in the tax code. And they were able to do it by letting the process work. This process has resulted over 200 years in giving us a lot of tough decisions that took time, that were done very slowly, that became compromises to reach the goal. Ronald Reagan didn't get everything he wanted in 1986. Bill Bradley didn't get everything he wanted in 1986. And Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Rostenkowski, got nothing. Not one thing that he wanted in the bill. His bill was literally thrown off the side. But this is how the system can work with people. If you look, let's move forward. In the elections of 1984, Congressman Gingrich and the House Republicans put together an effort that they called the Contract with America. And it was a series of 10 promises of things they would do. And those 10 promises were their contract. The Senate Republicans did not join them in doing this. Some of the Republican senators individually did, but the Senate Republican Conference did not do that as a group. But one of the things that was used as a springboard was the failure of the Hillary health care plan in the Senate in August of 1994. Senator Mitchell never got cloture. We spent 3 weeks here, canceled the August recess, they never got a thing. But that was one of the issues which focused the country and focused the effort by Congressman Gingrich and the House Republicans to take back control of the House of Representatives, majority control for Republicans, for the first time in 40 years. The Republicans controlled the House of Representatives the last time in 1953 and 1954. Because of the elections in 1952, with Dwight Eisenhower as the Republican candidate, Republicans were able to get a majority in the House. That was the last time they had a majority until after the elections of 1994. Now, what that contract with America meant is the House Republicans spent the first 100 days putting the contract into effect. They worked themselves virtually to death doing it. I mean, they stayed here everything but a day or so on the weekends, and they worked almost 24 hours a day. Staff were living in their offices, members were living in their offices. Then this was way before the time where it became popular to live in your office. But they worked it very hard to get that done and passed almost all of those 10 points, 10 issues, 10 bills within the first 100 days. Then they backed off, sent them to the Senate. At that time, I was working for Senator Lott in the Senate. He had become a senator from the state of Mississippi, and he was the Republican whip in the Senate. And he told me to take a list of the contract with America, the 10 issues, laminate the card, put it in my pocket, and never, ever, ever be without it. Because he couldn't remember them, and we'd be in a meeting together, and he'd say, I want to quote to you from the 10, and I'd have to pull it out of my pocket, laminated list. But that was an effort that was put together, once again, in this case by Republicans, followed up in some cases. The Senate Republicans did not do nearly as good a job of getting the things passed in the Senate, and for obvious reasons. They didn't have the 60 votes they needed, but they passed a number of these issues and were able to pass them. Once again, it was working through the compromise system. It was working through the regular order system, a system which was based on starting at the subcommittee, working through subcommittee markup, going to full committee markup, and going to the floor. You look at that, and the way it worked for them was a way that made the Senate system work. The Senate system works if people are allowed to work the process. 1999, when we had a bill that was passed, that was brought to the Senate floor on changing the laws of cigarettes and how they would be punished. People who know, you probably know it much better than I do as a group of lawyers, the state attorneys general were trying to sue tobacco companies. Well, Senator Lott and other Republican senators decided they had to do something about this, so they took a bill through committee, in this case the Commerce Committee, because the Commerce Committee, it was chosen, they wrote the bill to go to the Commerce Committee because it had the most bipartisan opportunity. The Judiciary Committee would have been a horrible mess. It tended to be much more partisan than the Commerce Committee. Brought the bill out of the Commerce Committee, brought it to the floor. We spent 5 weeks on the floor and failed. Couldn't get cloture. But if you look at the agreement that was made after that between the states and the cigarette companies, a lot of the ideas in that agreement were pieces that had come out of that debate and that piece of legislation. So even failing, and 5 weeks on the floor is a long time, even failing, it played a purpose in furthering public policy. You can like or hate the public policy, but it provided a place where people of the country and the states could look at what was going on, what members were saying, and whether they liked it or not. Now, let's move forward again. If you look at the 2006 elections, Republicans lose the majority, and Senator Reid from Nevada becomes the majority leader. Senator Reid, for whatever reason, had a real thing about George W. Bush, 43. He hated him. He flat out hated him. And so he spent the 2 years of 2007, 2008, just stopping everything he wanted to do. The Democrats behind President Obama in the elections of 2008 were hugely successful in taking a majority in the Senate, 60 members. It was a 60-40 majority in the Senate, and a huge House majority after the 2008 elections. So you had a Democrat, basically a filibuster-proof opportunity. And the choices that were made were to change the healthcare system in the United States and to change the banking system in the United States and the oversight of that banking system. They did not decide to try and change the immigration system in the United States. This was a conscious decision made. And as they moved forward, there were things they chose to do and things they chose not to do. The elections in 2010, what happened? The Democrats lost the majority in the House. They did not lose their majority in the Senate, they lost their majority in the House. And so what you had from that time onward is Senator Reid fundamentally changed the way the Senate works as an institution. He decided that there would be no more votes. And from that time on, you can look and see that subcommittees no longer really, there wasn't a policy that came out that was started at the subcommittee level, worked through at subcommittee level, worked then at committee level, and sent to the floor. Issues were always brought into the leader's office. He would convene a group of people he felt comfortable with, of Democrats, to sit there and put a bill together. They would then, from the majority leader's office, bring a bill to the floor, which most of his Democrats had not seen and had not participated in, and the committees of jurisdiction had not seen and not participated in. And little wonder, very little happened. And there were very few votes. If you watch the years 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, there were fewer and fewer and fewer votes allowed. Not only for Republicans, but fewer and fewer votes allowed for Democrats. In fact, a Democrat senator from the state of Alaska who ran for re-election in 2014 lost because he had done nothing. He had never offered an amendment in 6 years as a senator. Now understand Alaska. Alaska is a place where senators were quite active. Ted Stevens is a pretty good example. Like or dislike some of the things Senator Stevens did, he was an active legislator. Alaska was used to active legislators. And he lost his seat literally because he had never had the opportunity to ever offer an amendment in 6 years as a senator. This is what the evolution has become of the Senate over the last few years. In fact, the same thing happened in the House. You don't see the type of evolution of a bill from subcommittee to full committee to the floor to passing both houses to conference. When I was working for Senator Lott in 1999 and 2000, we literally had a situation where we could not find a time to get a conference committee to meet because the House members were either out of town, and if they were out of town, the senators weren't going to stay, or the senators were out of town and the House members were about to come back if the senators weren't around, and to get them to come back when they weren't going to be in session and be forced to vote was virtually impossible. That's back in 1999 and 2000. It's only gotten worse since then. A couple of thoughts, and then I'll stop, on how we might address this problem. First of all, being a congressman or a senator is a full-time job in D.C. I understand it's also a full-time job in your district, but it is a full-time job in Washington. and it will require more time. Members are not going to be able to get away with a 2 or a 2.5 day week if we're going to reestablish regular order. And by regular order, I mean sitting down, working something out at the subcommittee level, taking it to full committee, taking it to the floor, and then working it out through conference. James Wallner earlier called it conflict. That's fine. But the process is what makes it work, it makes the system work. If you go into subcommittee and you've got people who have ideas like this, and you never meet, you never vote, you never have anything that's taken from subcommittee to full committee to the floor, it never goes together. But if you have discussions at subcommittee level, you have to get enough votes to get it out of the subcommittee, you have to get enough votes to get it out of the committee, you start to do this. Call it conflict, that's fine. But as you do this, all of a sudden it gets smoother and the pieces can fit together. If the system is not allowed to work, it won't work. And so they simply have to put more time in. We need regular order, a return to regular order. We now have sometimes the things they call conferences. And at least they're calling them conferences. They aren't. For those people who've been around long enough to see what an actual conference was, that's not what we're doing now. They have a conference and the 2 or 3 people with the ranking minority and the chairman, or maybe a couple of others on each side, sit down, put it all together and go back to the conference and say, sign it, please. They don't really have meetings. They don't really work it out. This clock over here is the House clock. That clock over there is the Senate clock. This is actually throwback to a room that was numbered EF 100. Before we put all this in, there was a room right in the front of the Capitol under the steps called EF 100. They created it, it had on the south side a House clock, on the north side a Senate clock. The reason they created it is because they had a point in time back in the 19th century where the senators would not go over to the House to have a conference committee meeting, and the House members wouldn't go to the Senate. So they finally put this room together and said, okay, sit here in the middle. You haven't crossed the line. Senators sit on the north side of the line, House members sit on the south side of the line. But they literally had a House clock on the south wall and a Senate clock on the north wall, so they would know if they had to go for votes. So we've had times in the past where it hasn't worked that smoothly, but they kept working through the process. And the process is what can solve the problem, in my opinion. So those are the things I think you have to look for, is a regular order process. Now, 2 other things quickly before we go. One is, now that we've finished up, or the Senate will finish up tomorrow, everything they have to do for the year. I know you've all seen the press reports. I've read them in the newspaper. Once they get done with this bill, we have nothing more to do. I'm not sure I believe that's the case, but if that's the idea, let me make a modest suggestion. That modest suggestion is this. Since we have an agreement for the FY19 cap numbers, why not do the FY19 appropriations bills? Usually the biggest hurdle in getting to those bills is deciding that cap number, how much you're going to spend on defense, how much you're going to spend on discretionary spending, what the totals are going to be. That's done. That was done last month in the CR. Let's take this opportunity to try and go back and reinstate the idea of doing appropriations bills. If Congress would spend all its time between now and the end of September or early October when they go home doing appropriations bills, it'd probably be pretty good for Congress. And in fact, they might recapture the most powerful weapon Congress has in the balance of power between the different parts of government. Congress has given this away. Every time they do a CR, every time they do an omni, they give this away. This power is given away. No wonder the people downtown aren't worried about what Congress says. Used to be a time when Congress used to say, you didn't listen to me. Guess what? You're going to lose however much money. I remember a time when literally the Democrats demanded that a person who was working in the agriculture department for Ronald Reagan not be paid. They put it into the appropriations bill. They would not pay the position this person was in because they didn't like him. That's power of the purse. I don't like the way they did it. I think it was wrong, but that's power of the purse. If you don't ever do your appropriation bills, you never have the power of the purse. These are some of the things I think Congress has to do to address what has become a weakness and a Congress that no longer works. They've got to get back to regular order. And I think regular order solves most of the problems. Not going to happen overnight, but it will solve the problems that Congress has.
So thank you for that. Before we open up to audience questions, I just feel like there's a couple things I'd like to kind of highlight. It seems like there were definitely some themes that we heard both throughout the day and then also from the three of you today. And one of those that to kind of touch on one of the quotes that you started with, which was, don't judge us on the good we do. I think maybe the second half of that is judge us on the harm we prevent. Somewhere, and it feels as though we had a really good example of that from Mr. Hoppe, which is, even in failing, it played a purpose. We were talking about the tobacco settlements and how that kind of led. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, is that a way in which the process works itself out, or a way in which if we are somehow not being judged on the number of bills that we pass or the number of regulations that we pass, but on the way in which we help the country understand as citizens, as our members are citizens representing their districts, is there any truth to maybe that there should be some success counted for when we fail?
So that's a great question. So the quote from Fisher Ames, do not ask what good we do, he was actually saying because we don't do any good at all. Right? He says that's not a fair question in this time of faction. But I do think that on the broader question, there is a lot of what Congress does is under the surface. A lot of it is things that don't result in legislation at all, right? Oversight, things that come out. There's significant political science research suggesting that what's included in, or at least in the recent past, what was included in committee reports coming out of the Appropriations Committee has significant effects in reining in the administrative actors, even when that language isn't included in the appropriations bills themselves. So there's a lot that Congress does, and a lot of it does play into this public-facing function, right? There are, there have been throughout American history committee hearings that have changed the country. The Munitions Committee, the Senate Munitions Committee in the 1930s almost certainly delayed American entry into World War II by feeding into a budding pacifist movement, right? The Watergate hearings, even the Iran-Contra hearings, although they're regarded as a failure in many ways, significantly changed American public discourse. So I think there are all of these ways that, if we're just looking for an outcome like a bill passed or something like that, we are missing a lot of what Congress does. And if Congress only thinks of its power primarily in terms of passing bills, it's missing a lot of its sort of potent sources of influence and authority.
Congress is more than just a tote sheet. Representative democracy is, and once again, going back to the founders, what did they have to look at in the world? Few French philosophers, the parliamentary system in Great Britain, and yet they were able to build, almost miraculously, a system which has fit the fastest growing, the most, I think, arguably the greatest country over a period of a couple of hundred years on Earth. And yes, a lot of other things happened that they had nothing to do about, didn't foresee, all of those things. But they created a system which allowed the people to be involved in a way that dampened factions as much as it could. And what we've gotten away from is letting that system work. No, there wasn't a filibuster in the original Senate. It was, you voted because everybody said, okay, I'm ready to vote. The filibuster numbers were put in because they couldn't figure out how to get 100, well, not 100 people, there were whatever number of senators when we put it in, all of them to agree that it was time to vote. So it was an easier way to get something to happen that still protected minority rights. And that protection of minority rights is critical. I don't think the people of the country have any sense of what would happen if the Senate became a House of Representatives. But one of the things I'm willing to bet will happen is that you'll find out that the Senate is a lot easier body to lobby and control through peer pressure than the House is. If you're in the House and you're a member of a group, Freedom Caucus, CBC, any of the really active groups, In fact, they don't have to be all that active groups. You've got a group of people you're with, you work with. It doesn't make any difference if the leadership's mad at you. You got your buddies. You don't have that in the Senate. And I will point to an example. In November of 2013, the Democrats, some of the younger Democrats, decided that they wanted a change in the precedents, not the rules, because they knew they couldn't do that, but the precedents on filibustering nominations. There were not 50 Democrats who supported that. But the threats that were made by the younger Democrats against the others that these guys knew would be carried out got them to 51 votes. And so once they had that, Senator Reid went along and changed the precedents for them. That's how peer pressure works in the Senate, much stronger than in the House. And the reason we had a protection of minority rights was understood by the founders. We better not lose that understanding, because if we do, we will fundamentally change our country.
So then how do we avoid that? So you mentioned that, and then again came back to it, that Senator Reid fundamentally changed the way that the Senate operates. And I think that that is clear. One thing that I have a long background in oversight work, and one thing that I often say that people roll their eyes out is that every administration is the least transparent administration ever. It has nothing to do with politics. It's once somebody has successfully withheld the document that I asked for, the next guy's not going to be like, oh, but I'll give you mine. Like, that's just not a thing that happens. Where do we go in the Senate if, isn't this a one-way ratchet? It would mean that we would have to have a new majority to come in and a new person say, yes, I'm willing to cede some of the power that Senator Reid successfully took.
Well, one of the things I think would help with that is, once again, going back to the appropriations process. If the people downtown see you have leverage because you control their money, they will listen to you. And there's things you can do which are not saying, you can say, gee, maybe you won't get as much money this year for this because you didn't respond to our request for these documents. Once there's a cost to be paid for this, then things change. In addition to which, we do have to get back to really allowing members to have some part in this process and senators to have some part in this process. If you are never in a subcommittee that does anything, that gets anything to the floor, and never in a committee that gets anything to the floor, and when you report out something, it's taken by the leadership and changed in the way they want it, you sort of think, why am I doing this? What good is this? Well, you're right. What good is it if the system doesn't operate? How do you make that system operate? I don't know, but I think it has to start with the members who want to say, I'm not doing it this way anymore. I'm just not going to do it. I will vote no. You can get my vote, but you got to get my vote by earning it, by letting me be a part of the process, by letting the committees work as a part of the process, and by letting the process itself build. What it does is it builds to consensus. That's what it's done over the years. It was made to do that. It was created to do that, and it's hard to do. It was mentioned earlier. You got to get both houses of Congress to agree to the same thing, get the president to sign it. That ain't easy. But it works better. It really does work better in the end. Now, there's a lot of things I would love to get 100% of the stuff I like. If I was Minister of Truth, I have a whole lot of things I would do. But it would be a lousy government to have a Minister of Truth. So let's do it the way it was created, because those were pretty smart people who figured out a system that worked very well to make the United States a great country over 200 years. Let's not throw that out because we have some individuals who have tried to change the process here recently to fit their own political desires. That's a lousy reason to throw out 200 years of a system that worked.
I'd like to just suggest that the system has been in constant flux over those 200 years. So just a really quick snapshot, right? So Greg Koger's excellent book, Filibuster, points out that for the entirety of the 19th century, the House was by far the more obstructionist of the two chambers. The House was where legislation went to die. You can see this, he marshals a great deal of evidence in support of this. You can also see this in just quotes from members of Congress. There's a great line from Senator Richard Cook of Texas in 1880, where he says something like, it is well known that the House is where bills go to die. All these things that have come off the Senate are just, sitting there on the House calendar and never get passed. Then, of course, what happens in 1890 is you have the Reed rules, the first Reed, not Harry Reid, of course, but Thomas Brackett Reed, who in a very, very closely divided House, essentially changes unilaterally. It's the 19th century equivalent of the nuclear option, unilaterally changes the quorum rules by saying, you know what, you don't have to vote to be counted for a quorum. Instead, I'm going to count, if I can see you in the chamber, I'm going to count you for quorum purposes. This eliminated what was called the disappearing quorum. The House then used the new quorum rules to pass a whole suite of anti-obstructionist rules packages that fundamentally changed how the House worked. This was in tandem with the fact that starting in the 1880s, the House Rules Committee was made a standing committee with the Speaker of the House chairing it. So between 1880 and 1910, you had this massive concentration of power in the House, which meant that it went from the obstructionist chamber to the chamber that looks a little bit more like what it looks like today, which is to say a chamber where everything is controlled by the leadership of the majority party. That all changes in 1911 with the deposition of Speaker Cannon, right? So the apotheosis of this is in Speaker Joseph Cannon, who was called the Tsar, which, think about, we call lots of people czars today, but think about what it meant to call someone a czar before the Russian Revolution. He was seen to concentrate power so much that a cross-partisan coalition of progressive Republicans and Democrats passed a rules change over his objection, taking the Rules Committee away from him. And then for most of the 20th century, in the House, you get the gradual concentration of power in committee chairs that then actually, it's Gingrich, it's the 94 Republican Revolution that erodes that. It's Gingrich who then reconsolidates power. It starts in the 70s, but it really reaches its apotheosis with Gingrich, this sort of reconsolidation of power in party leadership in the House. At the same time in the Senate, right, for most of the 19th century, you could get everything through. That sort of starts falling apart in the early years of the 20th century. It comes to a head over the Armed Ships Bill during World War I, when what Woodrow Wilson called the little band of willful men led by Robert La Follette kept the Armed Ships Bill from passing at the very end of a Congress. That then leads to the first cloture bill, rule, which required 2/3. Then over the course of it's mostly used for the next 50 years to stop civil rights legislation. It's in the 1970s under Leader Mansfield that it gets both lowered to the 60-vote cloture threshold that we know today, and also we get the institution of the two-track system. And as a result of that, filibustering becomes more prominent, and the Senate becomes the sort of obstructionist body that we know today. And then that starts to change in the 21st century to some extent, at least for nominations, right, where the filibuster has now been eliminated. So I look at the history of legislative obstruction in America, and I see sine waves in both chambers, right? It goes up until the point at which a majority party finds it intolerable, at which point the rules get changed, and it goes back down until the point at which the majority party finds the concentration of power in the leadership of the party to be intolerable, at which point the rules get changed and obstruction goes back up again. So I don't see it as this sort of story of decline, and I certainly don't see the system we have now as sort of a straight line from anything that was created in the late 18th century, but rather a sort of constant working of things out, constant sort of cross-cutting of political currents that give us the two-cameral configurations that we have at any given moment, but they're always in flux.
So the sine waves that you speak of sounds, remarkably kind of the more maybe common parlance of the pendulum shifting, right? And we see that a lot in modern politics is, well, when things go too far one way, they kind of tend to come back. So I'm going to hear a little optimism in both of your answers that it is not a one-way ratchet, that we have an opportunity to have things align better with maybe what we think would be a functional and working Congress. Something that you said earlier on, Professor, is that we don't view politicians as a vocation. And I wanted to get a little clarity on that. And I wasn't clear if you were talking about the politicians themselves or the staffers or kind of the whole thing. And then maybe from both of you, if if term limits would help or hurt that, and if that kind of professionalism adds to or takes away from this natural ebb and flow or sine waves that happen when we're trying to figure out the best way to govern.
Right. So I think when I said that, a lot of our public discourse, at least in recent years, has sort of shied away from this idea of politics as a vocation, I meant to refer both to elected officials, but also to staff, to sort of all of the people who make the machinery of government run, right? We saw it in Senator Lee's talk, where he referred repeatedly to nameless, faceless bureaucrats. Now, come on, you guys all work in Washington, D.C. You all know some of these people. They have faces. Most of them even have names. And most of them are actually trying to do the best they can on a daily basis to run the government. But this constant, the sort of running against Washington when you're running for office, the constant denigration of people who work for the government, even as you yourself work for the government, I think what it does is it tends to suggest that expertise isn't important, right? The government is not its own skill set, right? We should run government like a business, or we should run it like something else, but we shouldn't regard governing as a skill set. But governing is a skill set. And if you don't regard it as that, then you wind up with people in office who have no idea how to do it, and then things go very badly. And so I think one of the most important things that we need to do, and this goes back to something Senator Kyle talked about, is civic education, right? This idea that we need to convince people that there is actually such a thing as governing, that it can be done well or badly, and that like everything else, it grows with experience. That is one, but by no means the only reason that term limits are a terrible idea. The other reason that term limits are a terrible idea is that they mean that the only people with experience in a capital are the lobbyists. And so the experience we have with term limits at the state level is that they just massively empower lobbyists. They don't particularly change. They change how legislators see their jobs. They make the legislators take their jobs less seriously, and they take away any institutional expertise that would have accrued, which means the only people in town who know anything about how to govern are the lobbyists.
I've never been much of a fan of term limits. I think we have a system that limits people if the people who elect them want to. Every 2 years, you can term limit your congressman. Just defeat him. Yes, I understand the benefits of incumbency and those sorts of things. The other thing is you get yahoos like me who spend 30 years as a staffer on Capitol Hill. And you really shouldn't have a situation where every 6 years you know your boss is going to be gone. That's really not healthy, guys. We can use, the Hill can use some expertise, but it ought not to be at the expense of having members who, if they earn it, get to continue. And I don't see the problem with if you've earned it, get to continue. Once again, I know that you can gerrymander districts and you can do a whole lot of things to keep people around. But by and large, you'd still have the right to vote, and if you don't like what the person's doing, figure out a way to defeat them.
So we definitely have time for questions. If there are questions in the audience of these two distinguished experts, we can take them or we can keep talking. Go ahead.
Yes, Ramon Buehler. I was a committee counsel for Congress for 14 years and saw some of the history, although you have a much broader level of experience. I wonder what the opinion of the panel is on term limits for committee chairman and term limits for speaker. Obviously, both of those affect the balance of power between the committee structure and the leadership. And maybe more generally, is there or should there be a stronger leadership or a weaker leadership, or what kinds of redistribution of power, if any, would you recommend in the House to make it work more effectively?
I'm not a big fan of term limits for committee chairman and subcommittee chairman. By the same token, I don't believe that these people are beyond being challenged. The ethic ought to be, if you don't think they're doing a good job and they haven't reported this type of stuff and they haven't included people in the committee, vote them out. So I'm in favor of the people on the committee making the decision of who their chairman is for both the full committee and the subcommittee. I think that makes reasonable sense. And part of the reason we don't do it now is because, gee, we haven't done it before, and boy, wouldn't it be an embarrassment if we voted the guy out? I don't think it's any great embarrassment whatsoever. And it makes the committee more responsible to the members. But I don't see necessarily there's magic in putting term limits internally within a conference on members' ability to serve in a leadership position in a committee. There ought to be more turnover. There ought to be more options. There ought to be the right for the people to have a secret ballot in the subcommittee as to who they want, a secret ballot in the full committee as to who they want, a secret ballot in the conference itself as to who they want as their leaders. And as long as you protect those, I think you can have a system where there will be some change in that, and ought to be. But I'm not a big fan of doing it the other way.
I agree completely with that. I would just add there is actually precedent for that. After the revolt against Speaker Cannon, when they reformed the Rules Committee, so up until that point, the Speaker had always been the chair of the Rules Committee. What they did was took away not only the appointment to the Rules Committee, but the speakership, the chairmanship of the Rules Committee from the Speaker. And the new rule said that the chair of the Rules Committee would be elected by the members of the Rules Committee, and that lasted until about the 1970s. So there is precedent for it, and I think I absolutely agree. I think it's a great way to do it.
I had one comment and one question. The comment is on the filibuster in judges, and in general for most appointees as well. That was extremely rare in 10 years. So it doesn't seem that's although the filibuster there was quote eliminated, it really wasn't used, especially for judges. So that's.
There used to be an idea that a president had the right to pick people as long as they weren't bad guys. The problem is we've come to define bad guys as somebody who disagrees with me. We all like to believe we're right all the time, but we ought to allow for the fact that maybe somebody else isn't necessarily evil just because they disagree with us. We've gotten away from that. That's one of the parts of the polarization that I think has gotten to be the worst.
I want to just cut in on that, though, because it is true that for a while in the mid-20th century, there was a pretty high confirmation rate for judges, especially if we're not counting Supreme Court justices. And there did seem to be this sense that judges sort of ought to be confirmed. On the other hand, throughout the entirety of the 19th century, judicial confirmation rates were quite low. Mike Gerhardt and Mike Stein have a really good article about this. And judges were routinely shot down for sort of not having the right politics. I think this is also something, again, that ebbs and flows. But I would suggest that, in a panel or in a conference on reinvigorating Article 1, right? I mean, the Constitution says that the president gets to nominate judges, and then with the advice and consent of the Senate. I see no reason to give any president a presumption of confirmation. In fact, refusing to confirm on anyone. Okay. I think refusing to confirm is one of the ways in which Congress, the Senate in particular, exercises significant amounts of power. And this was something that one of the speakers this morning talked about. I can't remember who was talked about it this morning, but talked about it as a blunt instrument, but it's a powerful instrument. Might have been Senator Kyle.
There's a lot to be said about the Senate approval process and what the Senate decides it is. But the specific point is, I think you, Professor, mentioned that something on the filibuster, but there really wasn't in practice. The only filibuster I'm aware of until about 10 years ago was Ford's, and even that one was complicated because it was probably more about getting more time, literally delaying to see what would happen than it was the filibuster was designed to block it. There's a distinction surely between voting someone down with a majority vote and a filibuster with people refusing 60 votes, and then I think filibuster is very effective in many ways. But isn't it different? It certainly was started with it wasn't used before, or it certainly was used going back quite a way for legislation.
That's true for a long time. I mean, the real rise of the filibuster for legislation is in the 1970s. That's when it starts to take off. From the 70s through the beginning of the 21st century, there was a period where where the filibuster was routinely used on legislation, but was not used on nominations. Beginning in the George W. Bush administration, it begins to be used with increasing regularity for nominations, including judicial nominations.
And speaking of getting our judges nominated and appointments, I think it's something that we heard a little bit about today as far as why we even are in a position where we need a conference and an entire initiative on restoring Article I power is that there seems to be a general trend and many examples of Congress delegating its authority over either to newly created agencies because something looks hard or tricky or challenging, or to the administration. I think one perfect example is the creation of IGs, right? Like Congress should do oversight of agencies, but that got really complicated, so now we're going to create an entire bunch of people whose job it is to do oversight of agencies. So now we have these people who have basically lifetime appointments who are or are not doing oversight of agencies. But are there examples, and I think, Professor, you spoke to this just a little bit about, is there an agreement on whether or not what does advice and consent mean? And at what point do we say this is the exact reason why we need to stop delegating authority to people other than what the Constitution, as you mentioned earlier, was providential document, tells us we should be doing? You have thoughts on kind of our own Congress's own responsibility and fault for where we are now?
So that's a big question with a lot of parts. So I think as far as what advice and consent means, you'll notice this is a theme of everything I say. It's changed over time. But I think the core of it, right, is that the Senate has to, at the end of the day, consent to at least principal executive branch officers and judges. I don't think there's any sort of constitutional requirement that it approach those nominations with any particular level of deference or lack thereof. I think that is something that is worked out in the politics of the moment. So, it's good to have your party control the Senate. It's even better to be a really popular president whose party controls the Senate. When we see, failed nominations at almost any level, it's usually because at least one of those two factors is lacking. So I don't think I think that is something that I think that's one of the ways in which our sort of regime of separation of powers adjusts to compensate for the politics of the day. When you've got a weak president in office, Congress has all sorts of incentives to be somewhat more active. I'm not sure quite how that relates to delegation, though. I tend to be probably a little bit more friendly to delegation than most of the people here today, certainly most of the people who've spoken today. I think it's impossible for a lot of the details of decisions to be made in Congress. I think, if we're talking about, how many parts per million of some chemical are safe in the air, I think that there are people at EPA who will have a better grasp on that. And I think one thing I have not heard mentioned yet today is the Administrative Procedures Act, but there's a lot that agencies have to go through in order to make regulations. So I tend to be, it's not that we don't have stupid delegations, but we also have stupid statutes. It's not that we don't have overzealous bureaucrats, but we also have overzealous legislators. So I tend to be a little bit, I think, more friendly to it than most.
The only thing I'd add is, as you have gotten a greater and greater amount of control over the economy, over the regulatory system that controls actions within the United States of America, you have, by Congress ceding excessively, and I agree with you, you can't have Congress, they are not capable of writing the detail of every law and regulation, of every regulation you have. The problem is they've gone way the other way, and they have ceded authority to the regulatory bodies, and then the Chevron decision basically put that on steroids. To say that that the bureaucrats should tell the Congress what they meant to say. Well, when you're as vague as the Congress has been many times, I guess you can give that away. But that's the problem. Congress became very vague in what they did. My view is it started with President Wilson and his view of authority, more authority going to the executive branch of government. It was incredibly speeded up during particularly the New Deal, but as much as anything, World War II, which had to be fought in a certain way, and you had to give incredible power and authority to the federal government. We never quite came back from that, and I think it's to our detriment that we didn't. But there has to be a middle ground here, in my opinion, where Congress has more control so that they are at least outlining the reach of the regulatory agencies, which is not very well done in legislation right now, in my opinion.
I agree. And the one thing I would just add to that, though, is that this is not a problem unique to regulation. Right, so if you think about the structure of American antitrust law, it stems from the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is this long, and the entirety of American antitrust law has some of it's been worked out by administrative agencies in the second half of the 20th century, but long before they got their hands on it, a lot of it was worked out by the courts. It's some law professors have taken to calling it a common law statute, right? So if you're going to be delegating rulemaking authority to either the judges or the bureaucrats, actually I'd rather the bureaucrats, because they are at least answering to politically accountable agency heads. The judges answer to no one short of impeachment.
I agree with that. I agree with that completely, because once again, if you would ever go back to doing appropriations, you have a way to get at them.
Yeah.
But you don't have to get to the judges.
Exactly.
Thank you both for your comments today. I'd be interested in hearing from each of you how you might go about altering incentives for individual members of Congress to achieve some of the reforms that you've talked about. Mr. Hoppe, you mentioned that committee meetings today aren't real committee meetings, and that so much of the work that formerly was done in committee has been done by the leadership behind closed doors without the give and take of that ordinary process. How might one go about restoring that through incentives on members of the Senate?
It really has to be taken back by the members themselves. That's ultimately the only solution. They have to be ready to say, I'm not going to do this. You might be able to figure out a place where we can end up in the same place, but I'm not going to get there by you sitting in a room by yourself with 2 or 3 people where I have nothing to say about it. Either you bring me in, or I'm going to be as obstructionist as I can. And James Wallner this morning was saying there's a lot of power an individual senator has. The majority leader has one power: right of priority recognition when nobody controls the floor. That's it. Whole kit and caboodle right there. That's not much. Pretty thin reed. You can cause a lot of problems, but you've got to be open in communicating these things. Everything shouldn't be considered a personal attack on somebody. The institution isn't working correctly. I think it would work better this way. Let's talk about it. Because I think you find both sides of the aisle, a lot of members would say, you know what, I'd like to be involved too, whether they're on the minority side in the Senate right now, as the Democrats are, or the majority side as the Republicans are. In both cases, I can tell you the Democratic senators weren't all that excited about Harry Reid making every decision on everything they did for 4 or 5 or 6 years. They didn't say it very much. And one of the things you've got to be willing to have these conversations in an honest, open way. And we don't do that very, very often anymore. And one of the things is because everything's sort of a kill sport. One guy who got a lot of things done and was a thorn under the saddle for everybody, every minute of every day. And he made a lot of enemies doing it, but basically there were a whole lot of people who said, what he's saying might make sense, let's try. Phil Gramm. Phil Gramm got an enormous amount of stuff done. Now, he was not Bob Dole's best friend, but he made things be considered and broadened. Remember, this is a conversation we have to start having. Everything is not a personal attack and should not be a personal attack. But how do we make the system work better? And those are sort of open conversations. I know it's nice and easy for me to say it here, but I really think that's what has to go on. And part of that is having enough time together to talk to each other.
Professor.
When you're in town 2 days, I mean, you're doing something. You've got, senators' days are 15 minutes, by 15 minutes, by 15 minutes, by 15 minutes. Sometimes you say, okay, you're going to spend 15 minutes as in committee today. But that's their mindset. And House members maybe get half an hour. But there's no time, and very few people. You have members of the House Republican Conference who don't know other members of the House Republican Conference. And you have members of the Democratic Conference in the House who don't know other members, much less Republicans knowing Democrats and Democrats knowing Republicans. I'd get rid of the voting machines if you want to know how I'd really do it in the House.
Professor, would that work
if
we got rid of the voting machines? Would that work?
When you had to sit there and read through the list first time, second time, and somebody came down and they missed their first reading, they sat in a chair and waited till they came around the second time to call their name, which meant they spent 15, 20 minutes. And what did they do? Most of them didn't sit there looking at whatever this thing is in my pocket. They talked to each other. They actually talked to each other.
So
Not a bad system.
I completely agree with sort of, I think, 2 big points in there, right? One is that we would all be better off if members spent a lot more time in Washington and spent that time with each other. I think we can, ironically, and I'm not criticizing it, we can partly blame airline deregulation. It's too cheap for them to fly home. And here I will say something that I am serious about that will be deeply unpopular in this room. We can also blame the lack of campaign finance reform because they have to spend just way too much of their time raising money. So I think that's one potential solution. One potential solution, and this is what you started out by saying, is that any impetus for change has to come from individual members who basically say they're fed up with it, right? That's what happened with the revolt against Speaker Cannon. But also I was reading at lunch just a quick sort of news hit on the omnibus, and apparently some reporters were standing around talking to, I can't remember who it was, one of the senators in the hallway, and they asked him, I think it might have been Grassley, asked him, when is the vote going to happen in the Senate? And he said, I don't know. And at just that moment, McConnell comes out of the next door down. And so the senator says, well, why don't you ask him? And so they ask him, and he says, I don't know, ask Rand Paul. When's he going to let us vote? Right? So it's right. At some point, some member has to do that. The third thing I would say, just very quickly, is that in terms of institutional reform, and this is for reform of formal rules, and I know a lot of what we're talking about is informal rules, but for reform of formal rules, one thing that can really be the reformer's friend are sunrise provisions. That is to say, the future is always uncertain, especially the future after the next election is always uncertain. So if you, rules change that takes effect immediately, you always know whose ox it gores. Well, so one way you can sort of put that off is say, we're going to change the rules, but it's not going to take effect until after the next election. Especially if it's anticipated to be a somewhat close election, that the uncertainty that creates then puts everybody behind a veil of ignorance, and they can think in terms of what would be a good reform for me, thinking I might be in the majority or I might be in the minority. So just put input for that.
So we didn't get too much of Professor Schoenbrod's thoughts on this, but as closing thoughts, we have a couple minutes left. One of the things that he said was that there is this human nature and this desire to be fair, and if we kind of figure out a way to tap into this human nature, this desire to be fair. I wrote it down because I thought it was very interesting, and I'm very curious as to whether the people on the panel agree that there is human nature and a desire to be fair. I know just now we were talking about how one of the reasons there's so much tension is that it has become a blood sport, and that this idea that if you disagree with me on whether or not there is overregulation of a particular broadband deployment, that I am the devil. I had a very interesting conversation recently with a former White House counsel to President Obama who said, yeah, when we put net neutrality in place, it was really complicated, and we all kind of hemmed and hawed over whether it was the right thing, and you guys take net neutrality out, and it's very obvious to everyone that it's the worst thing on the planet, and you're all murderers, or the best thing on the planet, I'm sorry, and we're killing the internet. So in closing thoughts, is there a desire to be fair, and will that be the solution? And any other final closing thoughts as we wrap this up?
In the end, what you find out is the House and the Senate are really very human institutions. They are based on relationships. To the degree we don't let relationships happen because Doesn't make any difference if you go to subcommittee. You never get to mark up anything. You never get to the degree you make those relationships mean something because they have an effect on the success of what you want to do. I mean, you find every once in a while, and it's sort of shocking, you find Senator Lee and Senator Coons who have a bill together. They sort of found each other, realizing that each one couldn't get exactly what they wanted, but there was enough in common about what they wanted to achieve that if they worked together, they might get it. The system ought to help build that, and right now the system doesn't. The system is breaking that apart because they don't spend enough time here, because the leadership has taken to writing everything. I mean, look at the bill they passed today in the House. That's a lot of legislation. I mean, it's not nearly as much as they were talking about a week ago. I mean, there were another 2,000 pages of stuff that just got thrown out the window because, for various and assorted reasons, thank God, they did it. And I know if the speaker were here, I would receive a sharp rap on the knuckles for saying anything like that. But you've got to let people be a part of this process. If they are, they'll act like people. And we've taken that away.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think, I'm often skeptical about claims of human nature. I think human beings are highly malleable and adaptable creatures. And so a lot of what institutions do is they shape people. This is actually what education is, right? Is the shaping of the sort of raw material of egotistical, obnoxious infants into socialized adults, right? And in that sense, that kind of socializing function of education continues through any institution with which you're a part. So when a legislative chamber is structured in a way that sort of atomizes individual members and shunts them off either on their own or into groups where they're only talking to other members of their party, it is going to socialize them into very much of this us versus them mentality. If the institution is changed somewhat, it can socialize them in very different ways. So I absolutely agree that, as you put it, the system should help build that, right? The system should be structured for sort of pro-sociality or for cooperation and compromise, and there are various ways to do that. The one thing standing in the way, and it's a thing that hasn't really come up much today, but it is worth talking about the fact that, so you sort of brought up what Cass Sunstein has called partyism, this idea that increasingly people from the other party are not just your sort of ideological opponents, but actually your enemies and are bad. And one reason that's happened is that the parties have actually become more coherent over the course of the last 4 decades or so. That is to say, it used to be the case that the parties were sort of imperfect sorting mechanisms, that you had Democrats who were more conservative than some Republicans, you had Republicans who were more liberal than some Democrats, you had all kinds of issues that cut across party lines, and so people got used to working with members of the other party. This didn't make them any more open-minded. Right? It just meant that in that particular context, the people they thought of as their enemies didn't line up perfectly with the people they thought of as the other party. Right? I mean, if you think that people were more open-minded about politics in the 1940s or 1950s or 1960s, then you haven't read anything about Joseph McCarthy or Richard Nixon, or for that matter, segregation, right? Which of course was a function of politics. So it wasn't that people were more open-minded, it's just that the parties and ideologies didn't line up as nicely. Now they line up really nicely. So, people who really, people who respond to polls and say they wouldn't want their child to marry someone who is a member of the other party, that's disturbing in certain ways, but it's also highly rational in other ways, because being a member of that party now tells you a lot more about that person and that person's deep ideological commitments than it would have in, say, 1975.
Interesting, thought-provoking. Definitely thank you for your time. Thank you to the Federalist Society and the Article 1 Initiative.